Great. We're going to go ahead and get started now since it's a couple minutes past 10. I want to start off by thanking everybody for taking the time to join us this morning for the presentation on conducting a vendor search, benefits and best practices. Before we get started, just a couple housekeeping items. We are recording this presentation and we'll have a recording available later this week. We will also be sending out as a follow-up a copy of the slide deck to everybody that registered, so you'll be getting a copy of that in the next few days as well. To keep the background noise to a minimum, we've put everybody on hold. If you have a question, you should be able to, through the GoToWebinar panel, submit a question, and I'll try and address those as we go, or if I'm not able to do that at the end, we'll certainly make time to address any questions that come in. Before we begin, my name is Scott Cameron. I'm a principal with Multnomah Group. I oversee our investment and vendor research here, and so I'm involved in all of the record-keeping vendor search projects that we engage on behalf of our clients. The agenda that I was hoping to cover today was talk a little bit about the benefits of conducting a vendor search, the frequency and timing of those searches that you may consider as a plan sponsor, how you should be evaluating vendors during that and assessing their proposals, and then best practices, a timeline, kind of the steps to go through in the search process, a sample search schedule, and a few tips for conversion if you select a new vendor, and some things to avoid. And lastly, we have a couple case studies that we'll be talking about that show this process in a little bit more detail and some of the objectives and outcomes that were derived from that. Now, conducting a vendor search, I think, has multiple benefits. First, it can help satisfy certain fiduciary responsibilities that you have as a plan fiduciary, including monitoring and evaluating the service provider's performance and ensuring fee reasonableness in light of the services being performed. It's very difficult to ensure fee reasonableness if you, one, don't know what you're paying today, don't have a good context for the services that you're receiving for that, and then have a broader understanding of how that may compare in the marketplace. Vendor search can also help provide participant information, understanding kind of what the tools and capabilities are out there from different providers to better inform your participants making choices about their investment account. So from that perspective, I think there's some fiduciary benefits to conducting a vendor search. There's also just some plan operational benefits that can come from conducting a search. With the primary one being, by evaluating service providers in the marketplace, you can better determine whether there's opportunities to outsource or offload some of the plan administration services that maybe you've been handling internally. One of the trends that we see in the marketplace is more and more of the vendors that are competitive are willing to take on additional responsibilities around some of the kind of the painful plan administration aspects that you've done internally. It could be outsourcing certain HR functions like loan or hardship approval, distribution approval. It could be calculating employer contributions. It could be even going so far as to take on some fiduciary responsibility with respect to the administration of the plan, serving as an ERISA 316 fiduciary. So I think there's both the fiduciary benefits of conducting searches periodically, but there's also some practical benefits that can come from taking a look at what's out there in the market, whether that's attractive to you, and reducing the burden of sponsoring the plan on a daily basis. It also provides an opportunity to baseline and potentially enhance service levels for participants. with the goal of improving retirement outcomes for them. We're seeing it's a time of a pretty dynamic market in terms of the tools and capabilities and things that people are innovating on within the retirement plan marketplace. And conducting a search gives you a broader view of what's out there and whether that may be beneficial to you and to your plan participants. I guess regardless of whether you're making changes in this, I think what we find is conducting this search ends up improving the plan. Whether you change vendors or stay at the existing vendor, you have a better chance to improve the plan sponsor and participant technology, potentially enhance the tools that are available to participants either online or through print or other delivery mechanisms. And it also gives you a chance to potentially improve either service levels and or fees as part of this. So, there's a number of benefits that come through conducting a periodic search process. One of the frequent questions that we get asked is, from plan sponsor clients is, how frequently should we do this search? And there's no, I guess, bright line requirement that says you have to do a search every 2 years or every 5 years or every 10 years. But there is the ongoing responsibility to monitor and evaluate the services and the fees that you're paying for those services. I would say typically we see recommendations between 3 and 5 years, depending on the circumstance. I would say in our experience, 3 years is on the short end. I would say 5 years is probably a more reasonable number for most plan sponsors. We can see, depending on kind of the interim work that you're doing to benchmark fees and benchmark services, you may extend that past 5 years if you're doing some interim work that keeps you on top of kind of the vendor marketplace. Obviously, that's kind of the normal environment. If there are issues that you're having with your existing service provider, either you have a sense that the fees are too high or the service levels aren't acceptable, you shouldn't wait a 3-year to 5-year time frame to do a search. You can certainly do that at any point in time. One of the things that in addition to how frequently should we be doing this is when should we be doing this. It can be helpful to coordinate the vendor search and implementation with other plan activities, although at times it's also maybe overwhelming to do that. So a lot of it depends on individual circumstance. Historically it used to be that everybody assumed that you had to do a conversion on January 1st or December 31st to begin the new plan year. Given the daily valuation and the automation of the record keeping, the data necessary to do a mid-year transition is not a significant hurdle, and frequently we find that calendar year conversions are not ideal because of overlapping changes in benefits. The holiday season that kind of cuts short some of the education calendar, and the fact that so many other plan sponsors want to do conversions on that date. I would say it makes sense to look at doing a first of a calendar quarter, or if that doesn't make sense, potentially first of a month. A lot of it depends on your payroll frequency and timing, but making changes mid-year isn't as burdensome as it once was. In terms of the time it takes to do an implementation, as we look at beginning most processes by understanding what the targeted implementation date is, I think it makes sense to work back from there at least 6 months to give ample time during the search process and the conversion process to go at a measured pace. We've seen searches take much longer than that, which can be reasonable. We've also seen searches be done in a shorter time frame. It's feasible to do that, but it does it certainly puts more burden on you as a plan sponsor to compact that timeline much shorter than 6 months. In terms of what you should be looking for as you evaluate vendors, there's a number of factors that go into this. Certainly, at the top of the list, I think, is reputation in the marketplace. I would also say beyond reputation is market positioning. One of the trends that we've seen through the past decade of the industry is that there's been significant consolidation in the marketplace. The top 20 providers, if you look at Plan Sponsor's most recent survey, have north of 80% of retirement plan assets, and we're seeing vendors get out of the business, every year. Most recently, Mercer, a large consulting firm, has outsourced their defined contribution record keeping to Transamerica. We've seen other providers get out of the business. It seems like there's a couple big transactions every year. Last year, J.P. Morgan and Putnam consolidated their business with Great West and rebranded themselves as Empower. So certainly understanding the reputation in the marketplace as well as the positioning in the market. If you're going through what's a pretty time-consuming and process to select a new vendor, I think it's important to understand, how likely they are to be around to service your plan 3 years from now, 5 years from now, potentially 10 years from now. And so understanding kind of their business model and their commitment to the industry is critical. Also, beyond understanding that reputation and positioning in the marketplace, understanding their experience with plans similar to your own. That can be at a macro level. If you're a tax-exempt plan sponsor, understanding their capabilities with respect to 403B plans versus 401K services. At a micro level, it could be specific plan features that you have or certain locations that you may have, but understanding their experience in the marketplace. Trying to gauge current and former client satisfaction levels. This is a challenge that there's not good kind of broadly available industry data. We frequently ask about client retention data, which is self-reported and isn't always consistently measured. So that's a tool, but if the data is extremely high in terms of client retention, we tend to take that with a grain of salt. If it's low, that's a red flag. We can also look at things like reference clients, and if you're working with a consultant that maybe has shared clients with that record keeper, their clients, existing clients, satisfaction levels. The service model, I think, is important to understand. Ultimately, at the end of the day, as we go through these process, service model is a factor that is frequently the deciding factor in whether they choose to hire a firm. What we're talking about here is, specifically how they're going to service your plan. We see some vendors that tend to have higher volumes of clients with a shared service team, where you're maybe working with a remote location, call center type approach. You call in, everybody has shared access to your plan data, and it's they're highly responsive. Somebody's going to pick up the phone because there's a big group in that call center. You see other service providers where they have more of a local relationship management and potentially planned service solution that can give you maybe a higher touch service model, but maybe it makes the service more dependent on whether you have a good relationship manager. And we see hybrids. Ultimately, as a plan sponsor, I think as you go through this, you have you determine whether your preference of how you want to operate your plan. Do you want a more person or people-dependent solution where you can build a relationship with your relationship manager and they meet all your needs, or do you want a more of an institutional approach? Understanding the difference in service model and how that fits with what your preference is, I think, is important. Understanding what services they're going to provide with respect to participant education and enrollment support. One of the things that we're seeing as we evaluate vendors today is historically how we used to look at participant education was we asked the number of days that you're willing to commit a person on site. Maybe it's semi-annually for 2 days. Maybe you are a high service plan sponsor and you want somebody there monthly to meet with your participants. So frequently in an RFP we would say, we need 10 days of education this year, or 15 days, or 2 days, and whether the vendor could meet that commitment was the primary determinant in kind of the level of education services that they would provide. We're seeing fewer plan sponsors focus on group education. We're seeing a combination of technology solutions, more individual advice, and from a plan sponsor perspective, what we're trying to do as we evaluate vendors on this now is ask them to demonstrate what they can do to be effective in meeting the objectives that we have from an education perspective. So using the experience they have working with similar clients, build a education and communication program that you think is going to be effective and demonstrate how that's been effective. So we're moving beyond kind of the counting statistics of, well, this vendor said they do 5 days and this other vendor said they do 8 days, so 8 days is better than 5, to put more burden on outcomes in the evaluation here, and making sure that the vendors can be very specific in demonstrating their capabilities and measuring the outcomes they're able to drive. We were also looking, aside from a participant education, communication, enrollment support, looking at it from the perspective of the plan sponsor, not only the kind of the service standards that they may have and the guarantees that they'll provide, but the quality of the reporting and analysis that they're able to provide to the plan sponsors. So the daily work needs to be done correctly and have a high degree of likelihood that that's accurate and high service standards, but also how are they going to partner with you to use what is a wealth of information that they maintain on their record-keeping system to report back and work with you to better improve your plan. And so that could be in the form of annual plan reviews, demographic reporting, custom dashboards. What are they going to do to take it beyond the basic processing of record keeping on a daily basis to help you as a plan sponsor? We also evaluate the conversion implementation process, the teams that they assign, or the experience they have converting from the existing vendor, the caseloads that they may have during that. And then lastly, looking kind of broadly at fees, just total cost, as well as their flexibility in paying those fees, their openness with respect to how they're earning revenue within the plan. Those are the kind of at a broad level the criteria to be looking at, in addition to the investment restrictions and limitations that may be on their platform, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. So at a high level, what does this process look like? The first step is to form a vendor search committee. For many clients, this is their retirement plan investment committee or their retirement plan administrative committee. In some cases, it may be a subset of that group. If it's a broader committee, trying to get decision making done in a time when it's pretty heavy commitment of time from the whole group, you may narrow that. In other cases, we see clients that maybe broaden the group beyond just the general decision making to get input from folks that aren't on the committee but may be involved on a daily basis in administering the plan, HR, payroll, benefits folks, or to get broader feedback from their participant population. But it's important at the outset to decide who has the authority to make decisions about this, and to make that clear to everybody involved. That is the search committee. The next step is to develop and manage a search schedule. I think it's always critical at the outset of any type of project, especially a project that's likely to lay out over 6 months or longer, to develop a timeline that shows the steps as well as who's responsible for each step. There are certain times during this process where the plan sponsor is going to be needing to commit, significantly greater time than at other points, depending on whether you're doing a search internally on your own or working with an outside consultant. If you're working with an outside consultant, there's not a whole lot of time requirement of the plan sponsor until it gets to the stage of analyzing the proposals and meeting with finalists. If you're doing it all internally, you need to know that there's a fair amount of upfront work to put together the questionnaire that you're going to send out, and then once those proposals come in, reading through proposals that are typically 70 to 100 pages, plus a few hundred pages of supplemental materials. You need to have appropriate time commitments there. Once you have the search schedule laid out, I think it's critical then to define the scope of the search and the objectives that you're going to accomplish. In terms of scope, most frequently what we're seeing is vendors looking to evaluate record-keeping services. You may find folks wanting to do investment work at the same time. I would say that that's, in our experience, usually best set aside and done separately from a record-keeping search, but it can be done at the same time. In terms of objectives, I think it's important to align the objectives based on the experiences that you've had and where your plan is currently. If you go back to the initial why are we doing this search, if you're doing it because it's time to do a search and we haven't done it, your objectives are probably going to be pretty standard in terms of we want a good participant experience, we want outsourced record keeping, we want a good investment menu. If you're doing the search because you have specific issues that you're looking to address, that should be in the objectives that are laid out. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we talk about a case study that we did. But being as clear and defined in the objectives, I think, is critical, because that's kind of the framework that you're going to evaluate all these vendors. We do find that in certain industries or employer types, it's also helpful to form participant focus groups. We've done this probably most frequently in the higher education market, but getting participant feedback at the outset, understanding what they're looking for from a vendor, can be helpful in communicating change at a later point and incorporating that feedback in the objectives. Not every client does focus groups, but it certainly can be helpful in helping set objectives and communicate process to participants through the search. Once you understand the objectives and the scope of the search, the next step is to pre-qualify vendors to solicit for proposals. There are dozens, probably hundreds of different record-keeping providers out there. It's not helpful to you to get proposals from everybody out there. If you're doing this search internally, I think there's a number of resources where you can get vendor names that maybe are experienced with your plan type. Could be firms like Plan Sponsor or other industry surveys out there. If you're working with a consultant, they should, based on their experience, be able to pre-qualify vendors. Really what you're looking for is to identify vendors that have experience with your plan type and can meet the objectives that are worth soliciting a proposal from. We have, years and years ago, done searches where we had as many as 30 proposals. It doesn't improve the quality of the search. And so, these days what we're seeing is you can get between 6 to 10, maybe 12 proposals, and have a high confidence that you have a good set of proposals if you do pre-qualification work, and that both, I think, improves the outcome, limits the time commitment that's necessary to review all those proposals, but it's important to do some pre-qualification work rather than just send it out to everybody that's ever record kept the plan. Following the pre-qualification process, developing a customized request for proposal questionnaire. There are, if you're looking to do this internally, some resources that are available to you. Spark Institute is an industry group that has as its members a lot of record-keeping firms. They've come together and put together a template questionnaire. There's other questionnaires that you may find out there that you could use as a starting point. If you're working with a consultant, certainly this is an area where they generally take a lot of the responsibility. And again, I think it's important to customize this document to the specific objectives and goals that you have rather than just kind of ask blanket questions. We see frequently where folks use off-the-shelf questionnaires without customizing them, that they ask questions that aren't appropriate based on the plan type or based on the scope of the search, and that can create confusion and challenges. If you are asking about services that you don't need because you didn't customize that document, you don't get the best proposals that come back. It's also important to ask very detailed and specific questions and write those questions in a way that gets the responses that you're looking for. So if you're looking for a very narrow yes, no, write questions appropriately. If you're looking for vendors to provide more context and clarity, write open-ended questions, but write them in a way that is likely to improve the outcome in terms of the response that you get. There also can tend to be a fair amount of lingo that's involved within the industry, and so trying to write questions that don't generate a lot of that, I think is important to look at. Once you have the universe of vendors that you're going to send this to, and you have your questionnaire developed, it's time to send that out into the marketplace. When we do that, I would say to get best responses, you want to give vendors enough time to respond to the proposal in a thoughtful way. I would say in most timelines we would build in 3 weeks, maybe a little bit longer, for them to receive and analyze that and put together their proposals. We try to do as much work as possible at the outset in putting together that questionnaire to provide the vendors with the information that they'll need to build a very detailed proposal. Things like plan documents, plan demographic, asset data, those things I think vendors are always looking for. But in this process, I think it's also beneficial to provide vendors an outlet once they get the document to solicit or seek additional information. So we have typically either solicited questions and put together a written FAQ midway through the search window, or hosted vendor conference calls to receive any questions and answer them so that all the vendors are on a level playing field. In our experience, it's important the more information that you can provide vendors, the better the proposals are going to be. You're going to get tighter pricing. You're going to get better, more narrowly focused responses. If vendors are having to make a lot of assumptions, you end up with a generic proposal that maybe doesn't give you a good sense of their capabilities. Once you've sent that out in the market, you're kind of waiting around. You give them their timeline to submit proposals. Once those come in, it's time to analyze those. And I think one of the challenges that we frequently see is that in analyzing those proposals, there tends to be a high degree of focus on fees. I think fees are important. I think they're a significant piece of the decision making, but I think they're probably overweighted in the analysis because they're the easiest thing to quantify. It's very easy to spreadsheet fees and say, okay, this vendor's cheaper than that vendor, so that makes them better. I think it's important to go back to the search objectives and to have using those objectives to find an assessment methodology that looks at those things like reputation, like service model, like service levels, experience, and evaluate the vendors beyond just looking and saying who's the cheapest provider. Once you've done the analysis, the committee should review those proposals and the analysis of those proposals and choose finalists. In our experience, usually we're seeing 3 finalists. I've seen 2, I've seen 4, much beyond 4, and you're not really talking about finalists, you're just talking about the proposals you've received. Usually what we find is that there are a group between 2 and 4 that do distinguish themselves through this process and are worth pursuing additional information. Those finalists are typically then invited in to conduct finalist presentations and may also warrant doing site visits or doing separate demonstrations to different portions of your population. Finalist presentations can be anywhere from 60 to 90 minutes in duration for each vendor. So if you're looking at 3 finalists, you're looking at 3 to 4.5 hours of committee time plus breaks. It's a big commitment to look at that group of finals presentations. One thing that I think is kind of critical when you're doing those finals presentations is to define the agenda and make sure that the vendors are speaking to the issues that you have and not just coming in and doing a sales pitch, but making sure that they're addressing the issues that you have when you're doing the search. At this stage, if you didn't get them during the search, it's important, I think, then to request and review sample service agreements, plan documents, notices, enrollment campaign materials, sample annual plan reviews, all the things that you're going to expect them to provide during the search. Frequently, that's provided as part of the proposal, but it's hard to review those in great detail if you've had 12 proposals, so you may wait until you're at the final stage to review those in greater detail. Once you've done the finals presentations, you can check vendor references. Reference checks, typically vendors should be able to provide 3 to 5 clients that speak highly of them. So I think if you go into those unprepared and just ask, how do you like them, they're not typically of high informational value. But if you prepare for those and target more specific questions about service levels and experience, I think you can generally get good information from vendor reference checks. Assuming you've picked one vendor following finals presentations and reference checks, then you negotiate any final service standards, fees, and agreement. And once you're comfortable that you're ready to move ahead, you're going to notify that vendor and notify all the other vendors that participated in that process, and then work with that vendor to develop a conversion timeline and implement the new plan. In terms of best practices along the way, one, document all the steps that you took. I think that's critical in helping document the prudence of your process. It can help limit liability at a later date. I think it's also helpful to review the plan design before you go through this change. If you're using a vendor document, you're typically going to restate to the new vendor document. So understanding what your plan design is and what, if any, changes you might want to make before making that change would be helpful. It's also frequently helpful to do an assessment from a fiduciary assessment before you begin the process. You then understand better kind of the things that are working well and the things you may want to address as part of a vendor search. I think one of the big advantages of going through this process is it does open up an opportunity to make changes in how you operate the plan and how it's designed. And if you have too narrow of a focus at the outset, you miss out on those opportunities. And then lastly, consider engaging a consultant to assist in managing the process. I would say, we think this is a value for a couple reasons. One is it certainly can offload a significant portion of the time commitment that you as a plan sponsor have to commit to the search. The consultant does much of the legwork, coordinating with vendors, responding to questions, providing follow-ups, analyzing proposals, managing details of finals that can be pretty burdensome to you as a plan sponsor. Two, I think good consultants can also help cut through some of the sales spin that comes when you're getting proposals from 12 different firms and 12 different salespeople. They can, based on their experience, better communicate kind of what is sales spin versus what's reality, and they also should have a good sense of the market and be able to bring the best set of vendors for your needs to the process. So if you look at a sample timeline, beginning in December, this is a timeline I think targeting July 1st of next year implementation. Establishing a committee, again, a broadly diversified committee. It may have HR, payroll, finance. It may have people that aren't on the retirement plan investment committee, but putting together a vendor review committee is the first step. Developing search scope and objectives, talking to the people that are involved in the plan. What are they looking for? What are the pain points that exist today? And then based on those search objectives, pre-qualifying vendors. Once that's done, developing the RFP, requesting proposals, evaluating those proposals gets you into February, choosing finalists by March, having finals presentations in mid-March, and picking a vendor by the end of March. So that in that timeline, you're looking at about a 4-month period from beginning the process to selecting a vendor, and then another 3 months implementation. So you're looking at a 7-month schedule. Again, 6 months is sufficient. Usually, it could be longer than that. It may be shorter than that, but it gets pretty challenging to go much shorter than that. A couple of tips if you do decide to make a vendor change as part of this. One, conversion processes and timelines can vary from provider to provider. I would say 60 to 90 days is what most vendors are looking for. You may see vendors willing to accommodate something shorter, and you may, depending on the complexity of the transition, see vendors pushing for a longer time period. I would say 90 days is usually comfortable. 60 is pretty aggressive, and it's important to keep in mind if this is a pretty impactful change to participants, the longer you give yourself, the more opportunity you have to do communication and be more thoughtful about the conversion. So if you're trying to rush, keep in mind that is really where you get squeezed the most, is on how you communicate to your participants during the transition. You can move records, you can meet the minimum notices in a shorter time frame, but the participant experience tends to suffer if you move too quickly. At the outset, ensure prompt notification to the prior vendor. The new vendor, for all the commitments that they make, are very much dependent on the cooperation of the old vendor in terms of getting them data and asset information and monies on a timely basis. We see vendors that if they're stressed and losing clients, may not be able to meet your timeline in the deconversion process. So the earlier and clearer you are in the notification to the prior vendor, the better off you're going to be. Another piece that's important and really should go kind of at the beginning of the process once you build your committee is understanding any contractual issues you have with the prior vendor. Are there termination fees that are involved? Are there liquidity constraints on some of the investment options? Is there a contract term that you're dealing with? Knowing all that information before you begin the process is important. If you are all the way into a search. You have provided notification to all your participants that you're going to make this change and expect it to happen in 2 months, and then you realize that you have a proprietary investment product that has a 12-month put and you can't move that for a year. That can create a challenge. So knowing contractual limits and investment liquidity provisions at the outset, I think, is also important. During the conversion, every vendor treats this a little bit differently. At a minimum, I think it's important to have updated weekly timelines. I'd say as a best practice, we see vendors hosting weekly conference calls where the vendor, the consultant, and the plan sponsor all participate. Those calls can be an hour plus some weeks, and other weeks they're 12-minute, everything's on track and we have everything we need check-in, but that provides some discipline in the process to make sure that everything's on track and communication is open and nobody's expecting something from somebody and the other party doesn't know that that's expected of them. So weekly calls, I would say, are best practice. And then, designing through this process an effective communication campaign. The new vendors should be well positioned to do that. Depending on your culture and the rationale for this change, I think it's important to communicate clearly to your participants why this change is being made. If there's distrust amongst your participant population, that can bleed into the search and the feedback that's given. So communicate openly, clearly about the benefits that come from this. There's almost always going to be benefits to a transition like this that are specifically targeted to the participant group. And so be clear and sell those benefits as part of the conversion. A couple other things: coordinate internal controls with any of the new operational requirements. As you go through the transition, there are usually going to be little things that you have to do differently than you've done in the past. It's important to update your internal controls to reflect that new operating reality and make sure you do training and education so people know what they need to be doing. That ties into training on the new website, new systems, so participants know how to, or not participants, but the daily plan administrators know how to do things like process payrolls and loans and hardships and do distributions and all of those things. It's important to train on the new system and update your internal controls to reflect how you need to operate going forward. And lastly, just ensuring kind of clarity of the roles and responsibilities during and after the conversion process, making sure that those things are in service agreements and are negotiated at the outset when you have the greatest degree of leverage. Don't just assume that the vendor is going to do something. Look to outsource and be explicit in contracting with them as much as possible. Because when you're doing the search and at the outset of the conversion is when you have the greatest degree of leverage over the vendor to get them to make commitments to service your plan. A few things to avoid through this process. Don't invite unqualified vendors to the table. It's just going to waste your time and not going to add value. Don't lose track of plan objectives. Sometimes what we see is at the outset you have a certain set of objectives, and as you go through this process, the focus tends to change to some of the flashier things. So if you're having administrative issues and you're going through this and a vendor comes in and kind of shows you the cool website or custom art they can do on your communication, don't forget why you're doing this search and what you're trying to accomplish. Again, don't assume that the vendor is going to do everything that you expect. Ask, be detailed and specific. Don't base vendor decisions on fund lineups. Again, we talked a little bit about this. Making investment changes, in most cases, I would say should be done separately from a record-keeping vendor search. It's pretty rare these days, but it does still happen that you're evaluating a vendor based on their investment menu. Most vendors, the expectation these days is open architecture. If it's not, you need to be evaluating the limits on flexibility of the investment menu or the investment platform that they have. So focus your decision making on any requirements for proprietary funds and the flexibility or lack of flexibility on their investment platform, rather than looking at, they put together a list of funds that did really well over the past 5 years. Don't overlook prior vendor liquidity issues and contract issues. And then, I guess lastly of this list, don't keep participants in the dark. Strong communication, frequent communication through this process is going to ensure that participants are comfortable with the transition that's happening, and you'll get a lot less pushback if you communicate frequently and clearly about the benefits of why you're doing this. A couple of case studies. This was a private university with the 403B plan. 3 different vendors to the plan, providing services to participants. Their objectives was to better meet the 403B regulation requirements that came about in 2009, to simplify the plan by consolidating vendors, which would enable them to improve the cost structure by negotiating with greater purchasing power, and to outsource more administration services. They went through a full vendor search, defined those objectives. Through this process, created participant focus groups to collect feedback and to better steer kind of the objectives that they had. And at the end of the day, they consolidated to a single vendor that could provide all the compliance testing services, as well as an open architecture investment platform. Because they had greater leverage, having one vendor, they were able to improve the service level commitments to participant education, getting an increase in on-campus education and commitments to customized communication materials. The 3 vendors each had proprietary investment platforms prior to this. They were able to choose a single vendor that had an open architecture investment platform with no proprietary fund requirements, and they facilitated the transfer of what these were old legacy individual contracts to a new group contract structure that had greater fee transparency, fee caps, and service guarantees. A different case was a biotech company with about 3,200 participants and $400 million in plan assets. They had a few objectives: improving the participant experience, plan cost and operation, but they were also hoping to be minimally disruptive to their participants. This really began as a fee benchmarking exercise where the initial fee data seemed to indicate that they were paying significantly above market. They weren't unhappy with their vendor, but were concerned about cost, so they defined those objectives, went through a search process to determine whether the benchmarking data was accurate and there was opportunities to reduce costs, or whether there was some outliers in the benchmarking data. What ended up happening is they selected a new vendor. In year 1, record-keeping fees decreased by almost $700,000. They kept pretty much the existing investment menu, but expanded with a little bit to include non-proprietary funds. They also switched to less expensive share classes of existing investment options, had better fee transparency, and improved participant experience, all while lowering fees. And the last case was a health services provider with about 1,000 participants and $140 million in plan assets. Their issues were really around the administration of the plan and the accuracy of that. They're also looking to outsource as much as possible from an administrative perspective while improving the participant experience. They went through this search process. Ultimately, they selected a new vendor. They maintained their existing investment menu, every single fund, including model portfolios that they had, as well as self-directed brokerage accounts. So from a participant experience, it was mildly disruptive, but pretty minimal. They found a new vendor that provided a dedicated multi-person service team that included direct contact with technical compliance expertise to handle some of the more complicated aspects of their plan. And they were also then able to make the conversion while outsourcing more of the plan operation, automating things like payroll to record-keeping system interface, improving match calculations in a number of factors. I think each case study is a little bit different in what they were trying to accomplish. In some cases, we're seeing consolidation of multi-vendor providers in the 403B or tax-exempt space. Other cases, we're seeing searches be primarily about fees or in some cases services. Usually there is some combination of benefits that comes from improving service levels and fees as part of this. In some cases it's one or the other, but there are a variety of reasons why vendors or plan sponsors are conducting a search. Knowing what those objectives are, leads to being able to achieve those objectives through the search process. With that, we're coming up on the end of our presentation. If you have any questions, feel free to email us. If you have a consultant you work with at Multnomah Group, feel free to ask them, or you can email our info email address and somebody will get back to you. We also have a white paper on our website that goes through much of this material. We will be sending out a copy of the slides in the next few days. And I want to thank everybody again for joining us and taking the time. If there's any questions, feel free to submit those now, but if not, we'll let everybody go and get back to their day. Not seeing any questions, so again, thank you for the time and have a good day.